Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or I'm sure good evening for some. My name is Tunde Olatunji. I am the Associate Director of Policy Initiatives at the Africa Center. And if you've joined us for programming in the past, we're happy to have you back. And if you're with us for the first time, welcome. We'll get started here in just a second, but before we do, just a quick word about the Africa Center. We are a multidisciplinary institution based in New York City, right at the top of Central Park. If you're ever in town, please come check us out. We work in arts and culture, policy, and commerce, and we're concerned primarily with how the world comes to understand the continent and making sure that the prevailing narratives really do justice to the actual lived experience of the people that they aim to represent. And we think it's important what informs the world's understanding of this place and its people, but also who gets to shape that understanding. And so we try to provide a platform for voices that we believe have important perspectives to add to the most consequential public policy questions of our time. As part of that work, we put on public programs such as this one, which is on the rapid pace of AI development and what Africa could do to best capitalize on this moment. And to help us do that, we're joined by a wonderful panel of experts who all, importantly, I think, occupy different spaces in the AI ecosystem. And so I'm hoping will give us as comprehensive a look at the issue as is possible in the time that we have today. Um, First, we're joined by Miriam Nkomalago, who is the founder of AI Frontier Africa, which is a specialized newsletter dedicated to advancing conversations on artificial intelligence governance, policy, and innovation across the African continent. She is joining us from Dodoma, Tanzania, which I am told is windy today. Adeyemi Owade is a senior associate at Advocate Law Practice in Lagos, Nigeria, with an expertise in AI governance, technology, regulation, and innovation across Africa. Mutale Nkonde is the CEO of AI for the People, which is a nonprofit communications firm whose mission is to have justice analysis be a more prominent part of all discussions about tech. Mutale is also currently a PhD candidate in digital humanities at the University of Cambridge, but we're lucky enough she's joining us actually from New York City as well. And finally, we have Ayantola Alayande, I'm so sorry, who is a researcher at the Global Center on AI Governance, where he works on issues of international cooperation in AI policymaking and governance, AI development in low and middle income countries, state-led AI governance in Africa, and AI security. Ayantola is also currently pursuing a PhD in technology and international development at the University of Oxford. There is just no way that I think those bios did justice to all the work that you guys are doing. So I'm sure the panelists will leave their contact information in the chat at some point if you guys would like to follow up and hear more about the cool work that they're doing. But thank you all for joining us. Can we get started? Great. Also, a small framing note for the discussion. The program is called The Next Decade of AI in Africa. It is sort of a forward-looking conversation. I kind of had it be a little bit more time-bound just because I think the closer to the present time that we talk about this magic technology, I think the less I'm asking you guys to be magicians and predict. So I don't, yes, AI will exist beyond the next decade, but let's talk about the near future, yeah? Perfect. Okay, Ayantola, I'd love to start with you. If you could just briefly explain, just for as if you're speaking to a five-year-old, right? The different kinds of AI that are currently being developed and give us a sense of the range of capabilities that are promised, right? I think there's probably a difference between ChatGPT and the kinds of models that are kind of being developed to mimic human intelligence. Is that the case? Could you just fill us in a bit if you would?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Tunde, for the introduction. So, I guess the best way to start is to kind of think about outline this kind of chronologically, right? So, if we think about so in the past, we had the good old-fashioned AI, right? Which is kind of rules-based system built on explicit logic. So usually if you think about your call centers, right? That says, oh, if you press one, then transfer to this person. That kind of system is what we used to call the rules-based system. Now, that was easier to implement to a larger extent than most of the deep learning frameworks that we have now, because it relies on what we call expert knowledge. So every sort of as if and then statement in that system has to be programmed in certain ways, right? So it was kind of easy to use. There wasn't so much buzz around the AI, but just to say AI has been around for a long time, right? So that's how we started. Now we then move to what we call kind of narrow AI systems, right? These are usually task-specific models that are based on classification, right? So largely, if you think about your decision trees, support vector machines, which are kind of used for, I'm trying to be as simple as possible here. They are smaller neural networks, right? That are used for things like anything that involves classification. So things like recommender algorithms, right? Detecting credit card fraud and those kind of stuff. Now, I suppose there's so much attention on the third stage that I call kind of transformer architecture that people call transformer architectures, basically. So these are deep learning models. So one example is large language model, which is kind of trained on a vast amount of unstructured data, right? And they're powerful because so first of all, they're general purpose. So they're trained on, billions of parameters and, billions of data points. And they are able to perform a wide range of what we call natural language processing tasks. So typically, you use these models for things like, um, your writing assistant, generating codes, everything that you can kind of think of from a knowledge-based perspective, kind of, desk-based work. Now, and they're also powerful because these tools can be adjusted or fine-tuned to perform other downstream tasks. So if you think about ChatGPT, which is a form of large language model, which is part of the transformer architecture, it could do a lot of stuff, right? But your ChatGPT is not necessarily fine-tuned to perform specific downstream tasks. So you could take another data set, for example, and kind of train it on your OpenAI GPT model and fine-tune that model to do something else. That's why usually you see people say things like, especially on the African continent, or we're applying AI for agriculture, or we're applying AI for health in the healthcare sector. Usually, a lot of these models are fine-tuning existing models. That doesn't mean that people are not building models from scratch, but largely on the African continent, very few people are kind of training or inferencing models from scratch. So you could fine-tune. So the next stage, which I suppose kind of following your the next decade, next future kind of framing, is what everyone's talking about AGI now. So artificial general intelligence. To the best of my knowledge, this is still very speculative. I would say it's very theoretical largely. But the idea behind AGI is that we'll be able to build models that are equally as powerful as humans, right? So they'll be able to kind of do a wide range of things that humans can do. One of the limitations of the current models is that they really cannot do a lot of things that have to deal with human reasoning. So things that involve emotions, for example. But the prediction in the future is that we'll have models that will be able to do this. So you would have a model, for example, that would be able to converse on a particular topic from start to finish at the same level of intelligence as humans. Whether that's possible or not, I really can't comment on that. And the next thing is what we kind of call artificial super intelligence. Now, the idea is this would surpass human intelligence. I think this is very kind of sci-fi like kind of dream that we're going to have models that would be able to find solutions to climate change. I mean, things that humans are basically not able to do now, right? And or find cures to cancers, this kind of stuff. One thing I did miss out though in the chain of the architecture is what we call large multimodal models. So I say a lot of this is just the same as LLMs, but just to kind of talk about how it evolved. So when ChatGPT was released, it was initially mostly a text-based model. So right now you have models that do things like text to speech, speech to text, so they're called multimodal because they can accommodate different forms of data structure, right? So you could give a text prompt and get, a video output. So for example, your Google Nano Banana, Google just released Nano Banana. I haven't tried that. There's, VO3, ChatGPT has, so many advanced models within that stack of products that can do lots of this multimodal stuff. So I can say, yeah, the landscape's really very wide now, thanks to the breakthrough in transformer architecture was around 2017. But I mean, um, yeah, we can talk a lot about
Yeah.
what's actually possible in the next 10 years with AGI or ASI and all this kind of stuff.
No, thank you. And we definitely will come back to that. But I think that's a really helpful framing for this. And it seems to me that at least right now, a lot of the sort of expected gains are largely in labor productivity is what it sounds like. And that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of where the possible impact will be. Muntali, if I could quickly come to you. So in this context of practical, real AI versus theoretical stuff. And as this discourse develops, what have been identified as like the main risks that people are facing? So when the anxiety part of the conversation, what is that generally related to?
So it's a number of things. And I think, uh, eh, I'm sorry, I'm going to say your name incorrectly.
Actually, you can just call me Tola. It's easier if that's it.
Okay. So
Tola.
I love Tola's overview. I don't know that I completely agree with it. I was with you, Tola, up until artificial general intelligence and superintelligence. And the reason that I was kind of with Tola up until that point is if we look at the literature, we're still even in these very early stages of large language models not being able to deal with multi-step processing. There was a paper from Apple that came out that said the AI that we actually have can't think past 3 or 4 stages. So when we think about what are the dangers of having artificial general intelligence, which one of the things that I think Tala really well pointed out to us is this idea around emotions and reasoning. So AI for the people, we've evolved slightly from the description that you gave, but we've effectively become a global policy shop where we offer some of this scenario planning to places like the UN, former US administrations, companies, and others. And one of the things that we identified, specifically thinking about risks, are the ways in which this inability to reason beyond certain steps, which is a technical issue, really does translate to when you're speaking about Black populations. Majority of my research is Black populations in the United States, but that would actually be the same if we were looking at Black populations in the United Kingdom. And then I'm Zambian. We have over 50 languages. So my language, Bemba, we may reason and think about in a different way to people who are speaking Lozi, which is another language in my country, and then extrapolate that across the continent where the we are divided into language systems and knowledge systems. And we can even go up further. Colonialism, are we really the countries that we say we are? So when we think about risks, it's this inability to really account for the lived experiences of people of African descent wherever we live and how that separates us. So if we're going to have a knowledge system, what type of knowledge is it? What type of language? Are we speaking about English being the basis? And if we're speaking about English being the basis, is that British English? Is that American English? Is that Australian English? I mean, people do not think about especially in a language like English, as having its tribal inferences in the same ways that we have our inference. So then take that further. If we don't know what the terms of reference are, because human beings are messy and we are diverse in ways in which AI systems are not, then how do we govern those systems? What kind of norms are within those systems? For the last 5 years, I've been an advisor for TikTok, which I hope if you all don't know it, you should, a social media company based in China. The parent company is in China. The reason that that's really important is coming from a Chinese development framework. They're extremely interested in safety and in regulation of their content in ways that American systems may not be. And it's kind of China and America where a lot of this commercial development is happening. From a policy perspective, that means that the way in which TikTok may operate in America, differs from the way that it would operate in Europe, differs from the way it would operate in Kenya, differs from the way that it operates in South Africa. And what we call that within industry is this idea of localization. That's a really, really small example that I'm hoping illustrates these wider issues that we're thinking about AI as one thing. We're thinking about development and innovation as one thing, and we're not doing anything for the localizations of the norms within a technology which in the near future is not fit for purpose for Black people wherever those Black people are, not because it's a bad technology, but because we have a very small population of the world developing it and embedding their norms. And then as we look forward to that, if we're looking at general intelligence, which is at this point a science experiment, what does that mean? And if we're looking at super general intelligence, where we're more intelligent than human beings, honestly, we would have solutions for climate change, but that's also a political question. And AI systems, which are tools, are not fit for purpose to fight big oil based in the United States, but then really having an impact downstream. And the last thing that I would say in terms of challenges is that we're not talking about data centers and the materiality of AI development and how continents like Africa that has big open space, has sunshine, has waterways, could actually become a place where those environments will be further populated to really drive the development in other parts of the region. I hate to be the bad news girl. I could go on forever, but I will yield to my colleagues.
No, thank you. And I think a lot of that stuff I hope we can come back to throughout this conversation, particularly this idea of localization of norms. I'd love to speak about ways that you, because that feels like an indispensable part of the process, also feels fairly complicated. And I don't know that it's being given the airtime that it maybe deserves. And I'd love to hear about how you think, what you think an effective process for that might be. Miriam, so we've gone into this idea, if hearing Tola and then with and then Mutale, it kind of gets to this sense that we're in this complicated mix of things that are happening and things that are still very much theoretical, right? And in the way AI is discussed in the mainstream, like how would you characterize how close we understand it to how close the science actually to the actual progress of the science? If I don't know if that's clear enough. Tell me if it isn't. I can try to expand on that.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Tunde. So from my understanding is that currently most African countries are still laying down the digital foundations for AI. And the progress for AI in the continent is unequal. There are some countries where they're already deploying applications, and then there's still some that are still facing basic infrastructure gaps. So what needs to be done, I can say, is that we need to focus on more scaling practical applications. As Mutale said, localization. We are looking to create AI applications that are fit for Africans. So if we're looking to develop these applications, let's say we're going into financial services. I can say with Tanzania, for example, we have mobile money, and there's a lot of scams that are being done through mobile money transactions. So we need to look into how can we enhance fraud detection in mobile money services. So we need to look at the things that are affecting the people and ensure that it's all inclusive. We're not only looking at the elites, we also need to look at the marginalized communities. If we're creating these things, how are they going to benefit from them as well? How are they going to, basically how they're going to benefit from these things as well. And also, we also need to make sure that as we're creating policies, how are these policies reflecting our communities? How are we ensuring that when we want to hold people accountable for these applications, how are they going to be held accountable from the perspective of Africans? And also when we want to build talent pipelines, we need to look into investing into the youth. How many people are aware of the capabilities of AI? And how can the youth be equipped to ensure that when they're building these AI solutions, they're building them specifically for Africans to help Africans? So what I can say in a nutshell, that we need to focus on making more practical, localized AI solutions so that they can work for Africans as well. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that's incredibly helpful. So if we were to drill down on that and talk about applications of these technologies in the public sector specifically, Mutale, I'd love to come back to you. And there is a lot of talk about sort of transformative potential, right? And unprecedented levels or pace of development due to these things in the public sector and sort of administration of the state more generally. How do you see what is like best case scenario here if things do play out as well as they could?
I think the best case scenario is that we're looking at, so AI systems generally, their big party trick is that they can take large amounts of information, sort, gather it, and create new connections. And I think that's what people have really liked, for example, about large language models, that they can dump in a bunch of stuff into the, I don't use them, so please forgive me if I'm using the wrong thing, but into the box. I don't know, somebody else can tell me. And then it's going to spit out, well, what this really means is whatever. That could be incredibly useful, particularly when you are digitizing or you are bringing online new data. My parents are in their 70s. They don't know their real birthdays. They know a birthday that they had selected, but at the time that both my parents were born, we were under colonization. So many babies were given the birthday of January 11th of that year. Wouldn't it be great if somebody had written down the actual date of my mother's birthday and we could dump that in and we could use AI systems for that? The reason that I use that example is that there are, to the point that I think Miriam made really, really well, was we're not dealing with human rights or civil rights, in that there's no human subject. It is a bunch of birth dates, and we're trying to figure out, or in the African context, we're trying to figure out where are the malaria hooks? Can we use these sorting technologies to find out where kids are getting malaria? Or it's really funny, Miriam, you were talking about jobs and young people. AI for the People's 5 years old, we're in the US, and I'm trying to build it to be an organization where people can come out of university and come and train in AI, responsible AI and ethics. And I'm trying to figure out, what does it mean for young people to have that entry level job into the field that we're already in and then go forward. But that's a human making the decision not to use an AI system to do that work, right? So it could be also used for other ways of keeping humans in the loop throughout the economic systems. I think those are all public sector projects. They are all in the public good. But to the point that Miriam just made, they have to align with local laws. And what we have, at least in the United States, are all of these big AI systems. Meta had a really great AI system. It was a simple AI system to help people rent apartments, but it was allowing people to exclude people that were interested in African American interests. And that was their way of excluding Black people. And so obviously, our Federal Trade Commission lawyers got onto that, and it was deemed that that didn't align with local laws. Meta is clearly not public sector, so it doesn't fit quite with the program, but it does give an illustration of how governments could use these same types of systems to identify housing, food, employment, those types of questions. Anyway, but you would need a human in the loop, because our AI systems do not reason at the level that human beings reason. So there are going to be other people that need to validate and comb through that data.
Okay, no, that there's a lot of stuff in there, but you're saying that so that's very much best case scenario, but even in that best case scenario, you would still advocate for there being a human in the loop, because you don't trust that these tools have gotten a hold or gotten a handle of the bias that is, I think, still evident in a lot of them. Okay, I think that's fair. So that's best case scenario.
And
I think
I'll just
please.
add that it's particularly dangerous with African words and names because we're not using English.
Important to know. Okay, so we are, it sounds like we are pretty much in as bad a scenario compared to everyone else who is going to be engaging with these tools than possible, which is very encouraging, and I thank you for that one. I want to bring you in, Yemi, if you would. So we've talked about this kind of best case scenario, but I think a lot of the other panelists have also discussed this idea of what we would need to do to get to a place where these tools can be effective. How would you characterize like readiness currently for across the continent? I know you can't speak for every single country, but if you just had to sort of broad glance across the continent, what is readiness looking like today?
Thank you very much. Listening to other panelists discussing this, I've heard several people mention some of the things I would like to mention, but looking at the ground, the laws, the policies, and the strategies that we have for now, we cannot as well say we are not ready and say we are still ready. I won't say it's a 50-50 readiness thing, but many have argued for the possibilities of we using the current landscape and frameworks that we have in data protection, consumer protection, employment laws to guide the regulation of artificial intelligence. For now, most countries in Africa don't have an artificial intelligence regulated law that's stricto sensu measure how AI should be adopted. Of course, the Artificial Intelligence Continental Strategy Policy was released by African Union last year. Before that, I think Mauritius and Egypt had several policy documents that was created to ensure that we would say this is how we are going to fund artificial intelligence adoption. This is what public policy would be like. So conversations around data governance. So what are we going to allow our data to be open for training of artificial intelligence? Conversations around copyright. How do we get copyright licensing for the data that will be used to train artificial intelligence? And infrastructure. What about the infrastructure that we need? Are we going to tell all government agencies to open the facilities and create all the data that has been collected and gathered in their regulatory engagement over the years and use it to train the artificial intelligence that we'll be creating in different countries? These were the efforts that the African Union built on when they were creating the Continental Artificial Intelligence Strategy Policy. And best to my knowledge, South Africa and Nigeria came after that AU Continental Artificial Intelligence Strategy Policy and created their own artificial intelligence strategy policy to fit what is the discussion. And most of the discussion is, how are we going to fund it? If we are funding it, how are we going to get data? And if we get the data, what about conversations around intellectual property protection, conversations around data protection, privacy issue? And when we are talking about privacy issue, we need to talk about online safety. How are we going to secure the people that will be using the data? Then conversations that are newly coming up is the issue of content moderation. How do you moderate the people who use it, age restrictions, and all these conversations are coming up. And when this comes up, we now begin to ask ourselves, do we have enough law that can guarantee the protection of the people who will be using this data or the people whose data will be used? So many have argued that the possibility of adjusting some of our laws, like for example, in most of all these countries, we have copyright laws, we have data protection. I think close to 40 different countries in Africa have data protection law. A bit of them has data protection articles or sections of their acts that speaks to emerging technologies and how you need to ensure you put in place certain facilities to ensure that you secure the data of the people that you collect while operating artificial intelligence. I think to some extent, if we want to go with that, we can still say we are partially getting ready. So we are getting ready.
Okay. So it sounds like there is some progress made. The AU has made some progress, and I think you've referenced a few countries as well that have developed at least AI strategies, which to me would feel like a starting point for all of this. But you've also mentioned, I think, some pretty important things, right? So issues of privacy rights and data governance and all these things. I guess my question would be whether do these have to be do you have to have a handle on these things before you sort of add AI to that ecosystem, or are these things that can be developed simultaneously, right? So is this a case of cart before the horse in trying to adopt AI while we still have these unresolved questions of how do we even govern people's data online? What are privacy rights? Do we have to do that first, or is this do you see do you see these as things that can be achieved sort of in tandem?
So the problem of regulation is that it's always good that regulation is forward looking. So most times when regulations or guidelines or policies are running after infrastructure, the problem is always that you tend to have to go back and quickly amend your laws and policies. So, which is why the Continental Artificial AI Strategy Policy document encourage people drafting policy documents to look at the EU AI Act, Artificial Intelligence Act, to ensure that we can quickly learn from them while we are trying to build our own. So it should be a forward-looking law rather than coming after the law as the tools has been developed. So what we are trying to do now is to ensure that we encourage policy makers and law drafters to ensure that they look ahead of the tools that will be implemented in the countries to regulate it the proper way other countries are doing that.
I think that's fair. So you're saying there is no harm in having these policies and frameworks already developed in the event that so that when these technologies do arrive in our societies, we're prepared as opposed to trying to build the plane as we fly it. I think that's very fair. Another aspect of readiness, I think we've touched on this, is this idea of where are the data centers housed and does that matter? And in terms of readiness, Tola, if I would love to come back to you and talk about this, say a perfect world and Africa was able to house all its data on the continent, or like we're able to move all these data centers back home. Can the current state of most countries, can we meet the power generation demands, and can we mitigate all the environmental costs of this? Are these things that we are prepared to do today, or is that capacity that we need to be built before we even start considering some of these questions?
Yeah, no, thanks. So that's a slightly kind of complicated question to answer. So I'll start from the data center capacity part, right? So the figures are kind of unstable. So some sources say we have about 100 data centers on the African continent. Data center map, which is usually the kind of most cited one, says we have about 200. But anyways, in the broader picture, actually, this is kind of nothing compared to, like, for context, the UK has about 500 data centers. That's just the UK alone. America has them in thousands. Now, where am I going with this? I'm a bit I have a slightly different position from most other people, as you might see, in terms of I think clearly we need more infrastructure. But just to come back to the point on data center, I suppose the question you're asking is whether we have data centers with actual AI capabilities, right? So this would be data centers that actually house advanced accelerators that are used for AI model training and model inferencing, right? So right now on the continent, there are only 4 of them, and they are all in South Africa, which is interesting. I invite people to read a paper by some of the researchers from the University of Oxford who have been working on compute. It's titled AI Compute and Sovereignty, something like that. I'm not too sure. But really, it does a very interesting job at mapping out where the sort of AI training and inferencing data centers exist all over the world, right? They are kind of concentrated in a few number of countries, actually, unsurprisingly, because there are only a few countries, actually notably the US and China, with the right capacity. So if you think about hyperscalers, so these are some of the most powerful cloud services producing companies. So your Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Tencent, Alibaba, that provide what you can call cloud services, as well as building, data regions, right? Cloud regions in different countries, right? There are only a few of them, and they're mostly American and Chinese. Maybe 1 or 2 are Europeans. So back to the question, there are only 4 of them in Africa, right? If talking about AI-specific data centers now, obviously data centers do a lot more than AI training or inferencing. Now, back to the point about, say things were to change magically. Like I said, I have a very different position. I think we should be expanding infrastructure. But I don't think things will change massively, right? These are very expensive, things to build. The other day we were still talking to one of the officials, in the digital economy ministry of one of the major countries in Africa. And so this person was saying how they had, visited one of the recent data centers in their country, and how, I mean, the biggest complaints you get, especially if these are local builders, is the return on investment. They are very expensive to build. And this is why most people would usually opt for, so 2 things. You just buy public cloud provisions from the hyperscalers. Now, the reason I'm advocating for building more infrastructure is, if you cannot talk about sovereignty, you cannot talk about data sovereignty if you're not building necessarily data centers, accelerators, and just broadly compute that's originating from the continent. You cannot talk about sovereignty if all you do is buy. So I think on one hand, we need to expand, but it takes a lot of infrastructure. So I think African countries need to be setting ambitious industrial policies for that. But the question on whether we could meet the energy demands or not, quite frankly, right now we can't, which is why I think broadly we need an industrial policy approach towards this. So one that aims to invest in infrastructure, and this is not differentiated in any way. So AI infrastructure alongside your kind of traditional infrastructure, undersea cable expansion, access to electricity and things like that. Because AI data centers, obviously, they consume a lot of energy. So for context, in Ireland alone, I think, so there was a report by Friends of the Earth in Ireland, which looks at how much energy needs have surged up in Ireland since data centers started coming into the country. I mean, Ireland is kind of petri dish for all sort of data centers right now in Europe. And the presence of AI data centers has, I think, tripled energy demands in Ireland alone. And an average data center consumes about 250 megawatts. I mean, the powerful ones, right? So to use Nigeria as an example, the entire country can only transmit, I think, about 5 gigawatts of electricity, right? So by the time you put in 10 massive data centers, AI training data centers there, it's just going to, blow up energy demands and push more people into energy poverty. There are ways around this, which is why people have started to talk about things like, regional cloud data centers. So for example, the ones that have been built in South Africa, how can we sort of expand or extend this network of harmonization, right? If what you're gunning for is really the sort of African sovereignty, right? So you need to be able to work around these sort of models. But right now, for most countries, I don't think we can cope with the energy demands. But I wager it's not just energy demands, right? It's also the water that you need to kind of cool these systems, because they need, large cooling water capacity. But also I'm predicting, right now everyone's been talking about e-waste. There's going to be a new type of waste that's coming out from the AI ecosystem. It's going to be the dumping of used accelerators and used chips on the African continent. So right now, I mean, as of last year, most people were trading or inferencing with NVIDIA's A100s. Now there are more advanced chips called H100s. Over time, these are going to be phased out. Where they're going to go, companies want to keep making money. A lot of them are going to be at some point, exported to the African continent, right? Because now new data centers are going to be built and they're going to be marketed in a different way to say, oh, Africa's AI future, and then we need to start building data centers. So this is why I am a big fan of governments having an ambitious industrial policy, but it's kind of a trade-off, really. How much can you really prioritize things like AI when you're still struggling with, basic welfare services provision? So I really do not know exactly how to answer in terms of mitigating the energy needs, but I do think on one hand, we need ambitious industrial policies that, ensures we have, developed infrastructure, especially data centers, right? So we're not at the whims and caprices of the big techs and having to buy cloud services all the time, which is in the long run even more expensive, right? And compromises national security and data sovereignty. On the other hand, we need to kind of keep investing in energy, right? Because there are no two ways about it. You're going to need energy. There's going to be some trade-offs. You don't want to push people further into energy poverty. And governments need to clearly set I imagine strict laws and regulations. But again, we can talk about the type of energy that we're using in these data centers. It could also be, maybe I'm very optimistic about green growth, but we could also talk about having alternative sources of energy, right?
Yeah.
That's what I would say. I have a very kind of dyadic position on this.
No, I think that's coming out for sure, and I think it's nice to approach this from the two angles that you and Mutale specifically are coming at this from. Mutale being like a full conscientious objector to these tools in general, and you advocating for much more investment in them. But just to put a bow around this the readiness conversation, I would say based on just hearing what you all have to say, it kind of sounds like a mixed bag in terms of where we are. And I don't know that there's a clear, I don't leave this feeling like we're ready tomorrow. I also don't get the sense that this is never going to be possible. On infrastructure, I would say I'll give us like a B minus in terms of readiness on data governance in general. That's, I think, like a C at best would be this is based on just hearing you guys describe this to me, and on our regulation of bias and our ability to sort of correct for these things. That feels like a failing grade right now, would you say? So I don't know if this is the most encouraging scenario in which I would try to throw in um new untested technology, but I think your point is well taken, Tol. I do think that if this were to be like a serious undertaking, I think there would need to be kind of intentional investment in these things. I think your point about the trade-offs, I think, is really important, because I think it would be a kind of a tough sell today to say Africa can generate twice as much electricity as it does today, and we're gonna commit most of it to powering data centers. So I think the case would need to be, I imagine it's not that simplistic, but I think you would need to sell that to me, I think, a bit more strongly. I want to turn to this question of like fairness and biasness. I think we've touched on it a lot, but I'd just love to get a bit more direct about it. And like Miriam, I think this concept of AI ethics keeps coming into this. I think we've gotten a sense of what that might be referring to, but could you just, in as simplistic a terms as you can, when we refer to ethics in the context of AI, like what are we referring to? What is bad AI, if that is a thing? And is that specifically just about the bias?
Tunde. So when we talk about ethical AI, we're basically saying that we need to build systems that are aligning with human rights, that are transparent, they're inclusive, and they hold people accountable. So for example, if you look into the farmers, when you build AI systems for crop monitoring, or let's say weather prediction, how much awareness do they have about this technology? Also, in terms of infrastructure, can they be able to access these applications? Will they need internet? Can they afford the internet? Can they afford the smartphones to access these technologies? And also in terms of transparency with policies, how much are people aware about the laws, their rights they have with their personal information? In regards to healthcare, the patients, how much do they know about their information that has been put up in these applications? And do they know the impacts that they can have, the effects? So I can say that right now with policies, I can say this with the Tanzanian perspective. I can say there's still more that needs to be done to establish policies that that support ethical AI development, which will hold people accountable, will hold the developers accountable, will hold these institutions accountable, and also hold the government accountable when things go wrong.
Okay, so that's helpful, and I think this idea of accountability keeps coming up, and I think it's a question I'd love to get answered if we can. Just in a, this is a lot of this is unprecedented, right? And I think we're willing to accept that we are sort of really are building this plane as we fly it as a society, but I think who these technologies have to be accountable to and who needs to be included in these things, if they're being developed by private companies, what really is their obligation and responsibility. I think there's a lot of blurred lines in terms of what is owed to society in these things and what is the prerogative of the people developing them. And I think that's something that I would love some clarity around at some point. Mutale, I want to come back to you. This idea of Africa's role in this more generally, right? I think a lot of the AI discussion exists in the US today, and I think with DeepSeek entering the news and sort of us understanding the pace of China's work as well, I think it's really concentrated in the US and China. I don't know that it's affecting like access yet. I'm sure it definitely is, and I'm sure it will down the line, but like we still have these tools, right? You can go on chatgpt.com or wherever you find these things on the continent. And I guess I wonder, is that enough? Or what is wrong with simply being sort of end users of these technologies? I think you've kind of touched on this a bit, but would that be an irresponsible endpoint for governments to decide that they really just want to guarantee access and that is the end of their responsibility to people? What would you say back?
I think it's deeply irresponsible. And Tola actually really spoke to this in his response around national security. So, for example, and I don't advocate for this, just so that anybody knows, I'm saying this publicly. But this idea that we need more data centers when we have load shedding, it just doesn't sit with me. However, having said that, what Tola was actually saying in that response was, if we have our own data centers in Africa and they are holding our data locally rather than putting them on a Microsoft cloud. I sit in the United States, and last year the Microsoft cloud went down and we couldn't fly planes. We couldn't check out food. We couldn't use hospitals. We couldn't, because the cloud, that infrastructure, that enterprise infrastructure supported so many other things that drive our economy and drive our society here in the United States. That would be the same for Africa. If all of these African governments have their data on clouds where the servers sit in Europe or America, then we're really not sovereign nations. We're really back to this colonial idea that all our and I think Yemi really spoke about this with Law, and even Miriam, all our assets sit outside of our continent. And so we do need to think about ways in which AI data can be sovereign and remain within the continent. And even within the continent, South Africa is one country. Not everything should sit in South Africa. We have to think about, are we in regions? and we have understandings around regional norms, localization, and that's where we're going to build out these sovereign systems, etc. I haven't thought about that, so I don't really want to go on the record, but that's one idea. And then the other idea, which we haven't spoken about at all in terms of Africa being end users, is if you go to places like Silicon Valley, or Tola and I are both in the Oxbridge network. We're both doing PhDs in those areas. We meet many African thinkers and innovators who sit outside of Africa doing this work, and then often don't work in Africa and bring that back. So it's like our innovation, research development, thinking and tools never quite make it home because we're trained outside of the continent with resources that are outside of the continent. And then if you're someone like me that has lived in the diaspora my whole life, that connection we have isn't coming back. So you also have this kind of secondary fact that the journals that come out of African universities are not being read in places like the US and China. Therefore, the IP that we create isn't there. I think Nigeria has a startup system, but Miriam, I'm not sure if Tanzania is like Zambia. We don't really have large scale VC development going into these startups that can be bought by, I don't know, a Microsoft or a Google, and then create that type of. I've seen things like instead of Silicon Valley, Sahara Valley, but what does that really look like? And are we getting the investment? And then the third thing that I would say in terms of bringing it home is that it's not just our intellectual power is displaced in places like Oxford, Cambridge, Stanford, Harvard. I don't know the Chinese universities, but I know that the Nigerians on this call, I know that they're Nigerian students in China building something, and it's amazing, but it belongs to China. Public funds, our governments are not also funding innovation. If we think about the birth of the internet was through DARPA, which is a US intelligence agency, and then it was rolled out. The Google people came, indexed the internet, and now we have Google. Our governments aren't doing that same type of work. And then again, not that I want a load of data centers in Africa, but Tola's shout for ambitious infrastructure and thinking about ways of bringing literally what we're creating home is a really important one if we can align it with things like sustainability goals by the UN and other markers by which we can keep doing this for at least another 10 generations, because we don't want the AI revolution to effectively ruin the continent first, but larger than that, the earth, because the continent is also the place that our young people are. I don't want to speak for too long, but we also don't have enough people in the West to use these systems. I just came from Japan. They have a diminishing population. They want to automate their whole economy. The problem is they don't have consumers. Africans have consumers. I also argue African has developers, and those developers should be gaining the same type of wealth as we've seen in America and other places.
So I think that's important. I think these points about the localization and sovereignty and what it really means for Africa, that all these things exist outside the continent. I think that's one piece of that equation for me. I think the other piece is what you ended with, which is this idea of who gets credit and compensation. And I want to come to you, Yemi, if you could, and just come back to this question of I don't know if this is a legitimate qualm or just me being frustrated because I'm Nigerian and this is whatever, but I don't know if you're familiar with, so there's this um a lot of the work, I don't know that Africa is recognized as like a contributor to a lot of the development of AI right now. I don't know that we're on the list of the people contributing to these systems being built, but I don't know if you saw that story about how OpenAI had worked with these workers in Kenya and paying them just these insane, I think it's like $1.50 or something an hour to train these models. and these companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars or whatever. And this really might just be a personal um, qualm of mine, but where does responsibility lie in terms of ensuring that people are not being exploited in these ways, right? Take away the pride of these people not getting the credit and working on these things, but in terms of, I know this is a newly developing space and we're not really sure how these things should work, but we have people working in tech and we have for a long time. Who does this fall to make sure that companies can get away with doing things like this and guaranteeing that people are adequately compensated for their work? Does that lie with the companies, or do governments in African countries have greater responsibility here as well?
Okay, thank you. I think the conversations around labor and workers' rights protection in Africa, it's an ongoing conversation. And now the gig economy, the platform economy, the creative economy has created another kind of conversation. And in so many parts of Africa now, the story you shared, the content moderation in Kenya, the team that were moderating Meta apps that went to court to sue for conversations around work time, work hour rates, the fee, the payment, the wages, and the likes. They stem from the terrible infrastructure that we have on ground. When I say infrastructure, now I'm talking about the framework regulating labor generally. And this conversation goes down to people working in mining sector too. It's more or less like the same conversation around the fact that how do we regulate people, and how do we prevent people from saying, okay, don't take this job. So don't take this job because they are offering you money. These people are poor and they need to feed. So even if you approach them and say the money is too much, don't take the job, that's another conversation. Then there is another conversation around the fact that you need to get governments to hold companies liable for what is the minimum wage that they pay. And holding governments liable, it's a labor law issue. And our labor law in so many African countries still allow menial jobs and blue collar jobs for things like this. So how do we regulate this? These are the conversations that are now starting in different parts. I think while preparing for this, I saw the International Labour Organization as a paper on regulating labor standards in platform economy, and it's a good place to start talking about what are the standards for people who work from home and work for companies developing platforms, for companies building AI, data labeling, and ensuring that they not only get paid the same way that a proper employee of a company will be paid for, they are also receiving all the proper labor rights that they should be properly remunerated for. And the next conversation is around, should we talk about collective bargaining responsibility? When I mean collective bargaining responsibilities, this is where unions and groups come in. If you recall, there was a time a couple of unions in France, Uber drivers sued Uber for the wrong wages selection, inappropriate payments of remunerations and the like, and they won in court. So this is the same conversation that came when Kenya Content Moderation Union, a couple of guys came together and they went to court to enforce their labor law. So these things come because we have people in the gig economy, people in the platform economy who are scattered abroad. They don't tend to have a group, a union that they can come together to fight together. So once you have once you have people coming together to fight their companies and enforcing their labor laws, you can have that. You can have a decision that can be enforced against the company. But the other angle to it is that what is the model to which these people operate? I mean, employment. What employment model? Are they just pay per minute or pay per service? In Africa, for Nigeria, for example, the model with which your employment states, the employment agreement states, it determines a whole lot of things. So, say for example, now you are just employed to just do a service. You are paid per service. You are a service provider, and as at that time, you are going to be paid per the service you work for. Whether the payment is commensurate for what you do is based on the agreement that you have signed. But then the conversation now come to begin to how do we ensure that people do not just sign anyhow agreement, which is where policy and labor law comes in, enforcing minimum wage for a certain kind of jobs. And this is still policy kind of discussion that we say we are still below par as to regulating the industry.
Gotcha. I see. Okay, so I appreciate that. But very, very quickly, if you had to pick and you say most responsibility for that lies with who? The government? Or are you saying labor groups or the companies themselves?
So majorly the conversations around what a capitalist will do to the people, to the proletariat, lies majorly
political answer. I need one answer. Who are you trying to talk over for here?
The regulator, the policymakers, actually. It lies majorly with the corporate policymakers and the regulators. So now, in some sectors, there is a certain amount of money that you cannot pay a certain set of people. This is the responsibility of the regulators to ensure that these people, while filing their annual report or while submitting their company annual report every year, they show that this is how much they pay, and they ensure that they comply with the labor law that is inside the country. So you ensure that you have the right remuneration to cater for this individual. But the other challenge to this is that, yes, the regulators have the highest responsibility to ensure compliance. But the other part of it is that people do employ companies who render this service. If you know how this content moderation team work for Meta, Meta employ a company who now employ these workers. So it seems as if you are not even reporting directly. You are reporting the money you pay to the company. So it's a little bit hard to now, and this contract responsibility, this contract kind of employment is very popular in different parts of Africa, such that it is now very hard to hold a company responsible for how are you paying your staff, because literally they are not the staff of the company using them. There are like 3 different layers before it reaches. So it's a little bit dicey to see this is how the regulator will hold them by the jugular and hold them responsible. So this conversation, yeah, the regulator is responsible, but while regulating and ensuring compliance, it is also important to know that, of course, the companies are responsible, but there are systems that are in place that allow the compliance to be navigated in a way that's favorable to the companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And I think the sort of process of subcontracting, I think, has been a way that a lot of these large companies have been able to sidestep some regulation, right? And I think they skirt some responsibility there if these people are not considered direct employees. And I'm sure this is different country to country, but that does seem like a loophole that I think might be helpful to be looked into. I would love to get into questions from the audience before we go, but just before we get to that, I wanted to ask 1 or 2 more sort of forward-looking questions on this, if I could. And this is, and you'll forgive me for this one, Tola, because I think it is less demanding of your technical expertise, I think. But I think just how much of this ship has sailed in terms of AI in Africa? How much of sort of Africa having to account for this and countries needing to like make sure this stage is set? How much of this is inevitable versus countries having the opportunity to opt out of these kind of huge shocks to their labor markets or opt out of the intense in environmental damage brought on by running these data centers? How much of this can we say no to? And does that opportunity lessen as time goes on?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. So first of all, I don't think we should be saying no or opting out, because actually we are seeing this technology have real impacts on the African continent now. So when I mean impact, I mean it in both positive and negative ways. But let me just use the opportunity to quickly kind of answer a point about the entire data center infrastructure expansion and all of that. So my position is that, look, I think generally when we talk about this on the African continent, we always treat it as an either or. So you either need to fix the basics, right, before you talk about a future with AI, or you need to kind of be doing all the social protections at first before you talk about these very disruptive technology. But really, in reality, that's not how policy works. You need to kind of, there are going to be competing priorities at any point in time. So you need to kind of know how to balance that. And I think this point kind of fits into the broader point around economic development that so right now we advise developing countries to kind of focus on things that they have productive capacity in, because that's the only way you can scale and meet up and catch up with the rest, and climb the ladder, whichever way we put it. But in reality, that's a kind of loser mentality, right? So if you think about the East Asian tigers and some of the countries that leapfrogged into development, really we want that for the African continent as well. They concentrated on both the things that they have unique capacities in, like your kind of unique domestic capacity already, and also future potential. So industries that you don't necessarily see yourself being able to do. So when China developed, say, nuclear power in the 60s, right? China was probably poorer than many African countries today. In fact, there are a lot of research out there about how China used to be poorer than countries like Kenya, right? So it shouldn't deter us from doing both. I know this is very optimistic and kind of very theoretical, but I'm saying that because even on the ground. So last week we had a seminar in Oxford with on AI benefit sharing, and the Nigerian minister was there kind of talking about what he's been doing on AI in Nigeria. And a lot of that's obviously focused on adoption, but for very pragmatic and feasible reasons, because you really cannot start to focus on compute now. The resources we are constrained in terms of resources. But I think the broader point is, if we really, Africa has up until now, I'm kind of very focused on the States. Africa has up until now negotiated from a place of weakness, right? We always trying to catch up with the rest of the world, right? Really, if you want to protect our people, if we want to anticipate a future that's kind of within our control, we need to actually be taking ambitious steps in terms of developing the AI, right? Adoption is good, like it would increase productivity or whatever. That's only partial equilibrium, right? If you really want to gain productive capacity, right? If you want to harness this for economic development, you need to be doing that. Obviously, alongside all the other policy guardrails. And the way to think about this question is to think about ICT adoption in the last 20 to 30 years, right? I always make this example that the best we've had from ICT is kind of, we've spun out a very interesting tech ecosystem. We have fintechs all over the place in Africa. We have a buzzing, we have buzzing tech hubs in Cape Town, in Nairobi, in Lagos, and everywhere on the continent, right? But it's still only a partial equilibrium. Less than 50% of the African continent has access to internet, right? And I think we do not want to repeat the same mistakes. We need to, at this point, kind of, it's a big thing for sure. There are so many industries that are calling for attention. We need to think about reviving manufacturing first, but I think we need to be moving up the ladder a little bit, right? Traditionally, when people think about AI in Africa, they think about two things: labor and use. So adoption. It's everything you say is about AI use cases, how AI is transforming Africa because the use cases are there. Anyone can use use cases. It could make so much massive difference. It couldn't make so much massive difference on the African continent, really, because really what gives, the jobs, what gives brings the economic development is when you have skin in the game. We don't at the moment. And even in terms of global regulations, how much can you really contribute to when you don't have as much skin in the game? So I have a very, I'll say maybe largely optimistic opinion about this, is that, well, the ship hasn't sailed fully yet. There's a lot to still be done. There's so many capabilities and gaps to fill that we can start to think about as a continent, right? But I would largely encourage us to kind of move from this sort of low hanging fruit of focusing on, when people think about the African capacity now, we think about data labelers and the people who do some of the hidden labels, right? There's a part of policy on that. I think this also fits in my broader point. If you have a coherent strategy as government, you can be able to cover some of these things, even some of the, I would say, largely policy arbitrage that these big techs are playing. You can cover that, right? But you need a holistic and ambitious approach to it. And I don't think we have that yet. Even the African Union Continental AI Strategy, I think it does outline some very interesting positions, but it misses a lot. And I say this as somebody who was kind of fortunate to work on it. So yeah, I think largely we need to get more ambitious. This doesn't deter us from putting all the policy guardrails in place, really.
I thank you. That's really helpful, and I think you keep describing yourself as being a little too optimistic. I really do value this perspective, and I think your notes on sort of not making the same mistakes as we maybe have in other kind of these generational technologies, and sort of where we place ourselves in those discussions, and trying to sort of occupy different places along this value chain and seeing what that might look like, but also acknowledging the fact that that does come with a considerable amount of cost and prioritization of these things. And I think for Africa specifically, the question will always be at the expense of what, and is that worth it? And I think these are discussions that much smarter people than myself will probably have to wrestle with. If you guys have any questions from the audience, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll ask them to the panelists as we go on. And as you guys do that, I will ask one more question, and if we could just go around, and if you could all just actually, not that. I would like to ask one question to Mutale specifically, if you wouldn't mind. And this is and then we'll come to the question I want to ask to all of you after we've done the audience questions. But so I think, I know you've seen these projections about sort of the next African decade and the new African era, and Africa kind of leading in this new world. A lot of those projections, at least to my reading, I think are based on this idea that there's no continent with as many young people of working age as Africa, and you have all these people that will translate into, considerable human capital. And that will be kind of the vehicle for Africa moving on up in the world. And I wonder where you think AI fits into this equation of human capital equaling currency in this new world, right? If we're saying that we have these tools that are going to completely transform the way that we do a lot of these jobs, and productivity, everything's going to require fewer people, does that calculus have to change a bit for Africa? And how do you see this, or is this kind of a negligible part of that whole process?
I'm actually really optimistic on this question, which, if anybody has spent any time on panels with me, it's probably quite surprising, but it does happen. I think it's two things. I think that we need to transform the paradigm. Tola did spend some time speaking about kind of getting us away from data labeling, which in my view is very close to, historically, we were the enslaved people. We were the people carrying we were people picking the cotton in the fields, but we didn't own the land. So kind of moving us from data labeling and moving us towards some of these high level work, the type of work that Yemi's doing, the type of work that Miriam's doing in shaping the norms, I think is number one, is very key. I think number two, you have young people, but if we can also fund our universities, you then have the next Google. Google was a PhD project. Tola and I are both in PhD programs right now. We buy that line of thinking could either build one of those types of companies if we were to go commercial, or set the type of norms. The other, but the more radical thing I'm thinking in terms of work and where do we fit in as Africans, is that I think that we are within the first 10 years of AI systems being out, and this is actually the moment that we just need to take space. So there various different things. I'm thinking Miriam was speaking about ethical AI, and I'm kind of in that space too, Miriam, kind of ethical, responsible AI. And in the United States, there are vehicles that we have, like the NAACP, which is the National Association of Colored People, who are actually raising $200 million for companies that will develop in ways that are rights respecting, in ways that can are energy respecting, all of these good, responsible, Yemi was speaking about content moderation. We're looking for use cases that will make the internet, and by extension, the technical world, safer places for Black people. And they are sourcing Black money to do that, and then hopefully putting those companies on the way to capitalization and impacting and shaping the field, because we can't have better AI without better companies. But I also think that there's here a call for the diaspora, for people, those of us who are outside, to build effective and real partnerships with those of us on the continent, to think about how can we bring our time, talent, and treasure into spaces like the Africa Center, to think about, as we work across geographies, how can we get these things home? And I think that type of AI development, or that type of taking hold of this system, requires imagining, it requires funding, it also requires convening that we're not having. And the reason that that comes up is, having been in the ByteDance universe for 5 years, it's always really interesting to think about what's happening in China within that company and their suite of companies, and how that relates to the Chinese diaspora across the world, and how they're thinking about building up their own AI systems, or, being at a British university where, unlike when I studied in the States, there is just so much more dialogue between Chinese students and other students, that I'm now getting an insight to how they're seeing their next 10 years, 50 years. And beyond. So it's not I don't know that I'm giving you a hard answer, but I am very optimistic about where we are. I do not think that it's too late. And I do think that we can have voice. We just have to be really, really strategic with each other, to think about how we can force that, because I don't think it's going to be top down. I also don't think it's going to be bottom up. I think it's going to be on the level of the panel where we are now.
No, thank you. That's very much a helpful answer. And I think that's I guess as optimistic as an answer I could have hoped, and I appreciate that. I think that is really, I think, a lot of where some of my anxiety lies, I think, is in this kind of unpreparedness and this kind of nightmare scenario where you have this wealth of young educated people with nowhere to point them, and what that does to a society over a long term, and just making sure that we're accounting for how this unknown can influence that dynamic.
And we are seeing that in the United States.
Very
It
much
leads to
so,
polarization, and it leads to breakdown of society.
which famously not a good thing. Would love to do a few questions from the audience if we could. Fauna asks if we can learn, anyone who wants to answer, please just jump in. If we can learn more about sort of what continental policy implementation looks like when we have such localized richness among different countries. Has something like this existed during the era of social media? So if we did want to develop a continent-wide process for how we engage with AI and adopt it, what would that look like across the continent? And would it need to be developed on a smaller scale, given all the differences in context that we've discussed?
I could go for that very quickly. I think I could just use the chance to also answer the question around what's missing in the AUI strategy. I think the African Union is a very kind of useful, efficient mechanism to think about kind of continent-wide harmonization and localization, right? The issue is often when you have this sort of continent-wide strategies, and AU has done this in so many other sectors, right? So for instance, someone's talking about startup, it does that with data protection, what it calls the model framework, sort of template that countries can follow. But usually what happens is, obviously, in the grand scheme of things, right, countries are usually kind of trying to prioritize themselves individually, right? So I remember last year when 2 years ago when the AI Risk Summit was happening, and then we're having this conversation around should African countries should be advancing like one front in terms of what to prioritize in international AI governance. I remember the Nigerian minister saying, well, for him, he's primarily concerned about Nigeria, right? So even as much as we're optimistic about sort of a kind of continental front to AI governance, we also have to realize that much of implementation, much of progress would happen at the national level. And so what you can do with frameworks like the AU is to kind of encourage sort of domestication of some of the policies that have come out. So for instance, the AU Continental AI Strategy covers a lot of stuff actually that could inform national AI strategies in different countries, right? And again, there's a lot to be done in this kind of forums, right? It's easier to kind of mobilize resources when you're talking about PPP and international funding. It's easier to kind of advocate for, one position on certain things when it comes to international governance of AI. So for example, advanced things on military use of AI or use of AI in nuclear, those kind of things are done much stronger on a continental level. So there's space for that. So in terms of what's missing in the AU AI strategies, it's kind of very difficult to answer in simple words. But I would say one is the kind of focus on infrastructure was not very extensive. Maybe I'm picking on that because it's something I'm very passionate about. And things like, R&D as well. The strategy did outline things around implementation. That's not really started yet. I think a couple of stuff should be done by now, by the end of 2025, according to what the strategy sort of outlined. Practically none of that is being done well yet. There are a lot of other things that surely can't be said on camera. But I think there's room to improve continental coordination while bearing in mind that countries would, in many cases, go very divergent routes, because at the end of the day, each country would prioritize most likely its relationship with other countries. Doesn't matter whether they're African countries. Sometimes above their other African countries, which is it's not the most ideal, but it's kind of what happens. I don't know if I answered well.
No, I think that was very helpful. And just to summarize, you would say the strategy could put a greater emphasis on improvement of infrastructure and also better coordination between countries.
Better
Thank
coordination
between
yeah.
countries. Thank you. Question from Vincent about, I think we've discussed how can Africa avoid becoming just a consumer of foreign AI models, instead position itself as a producer of indigenous AI innovations. I think we've discussed kind of the risks of missing out, but I guess does anyone have a practical way forward for doing that differently, I guess?
Investment and partnership with global universities.
Investments and partnerships. Nice and succinct. I love it. We can do one more from Bridget. How do we communicate these needs, ideas, concerns, etc., to people outside the tech space? One major problem is how amorphous the concept of AI seems to people with power. This is true. I think we're even if you just look here in the US and regulation of even just social media, I think you see these hearings on Capitol Hill, and it's just so blatantly obvious that these lawmakers have the most basic familiarity with a lot of these concepts and a lot of these places. I can only imagine that's multiplied with a thing like AI, where I think most people talking about it have no understanding of how we work. So how do we get around that problem?
You need strong media systems. So, for example, I'm on Sky News in the UK a good amount, and I'm on UK radio. But under this administration in the United States, they are not going to call a Black woman to talk about AI. So you also need non-racism. But Miriam, it sounds like this is your area. It sounds like you're doing incredible work with your work around this.
Yeah, I would love to. I'd love to hear more, and I'm sure the newsletter feels like an effective way to kind of bridge that gap and kind of simplifying a lot of these concepts to an audience of people who otherwise might not be looking for these things. Is that fair?
So, in the perspective within Africa, I can say localization can be a major help in raising awareness. As you said, that most of these people have basic understanding of this technology, and it's mainly because they don't know where to get the right information from. And I think within Africa, it's about time where more research needs to be done within our communities to understand our needs better, to know what works for us, and that can also help with policy making. We also need to have laws that are not archaic and also laws that are not too stringent to allow improvement with this fast evolving technology. And also in terms of funding, as Mutale said, the government also needs to look at how they can reach marginalized communities, because it is one thing to say you can tell universities to offer certain courses, but what about the people that cannot afford to attend those courses? What are they doing to help and ensure that there is inclusivity of all people within the community?
Thank you. I think that's a really salient point to end the discussion. And we're running up on time. We have a few more questions from Tara and Bilen, and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but I'm sure the panelists would be happy to follow up with you offline to answer those questions. Before we go, I just had one more. If I could just go around to all of you, if we could keep it sentence or two answer at best, at most. Are there any aspects of this entire AI discourse that you think are sort of not getting the airtime that they deserve? Any under-discussed elements of the work? I'll start with you, Mutale.
Anybody can engage in this conversation, and they should. And all of us started knowing nothing, and we encourage you to join us. We need you.
Great. Yemi, please. Oh, I think you might be muted, unfortunately. Can we try that again? Just in the interest of time, I'll come back to you. Okay, there you go. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was saying that I think it makes sense to now look more internally. I think every country, because we always assume that the continent will carry the load for us and Africa will do it. I think the responsibility is on both public sectors and private sectors in each countries to take up the responsibilities of building the systems that work for their culture and for their people.
So don't wait for these systems, build them yourselves. I like that. Miriam, please, if you would.
Just in addition to what Mutale and Yemi said, I think we're all responsible and we all need to find a way on how we can contribute into the proper building of these systems within the continent.
Cooperation and collective action has never failed. Tola, last but not least, please bring us home.
Thank you. I think for me it would be in the last 1 or 2 years, things have changed. Conversations about AI safety, AI security, which used to be kind of front burner, is now being pushed to the back seat because obviously the geopolitical climate. I would say as the African continent, we need to kind of not lose sight of this. We need people who are doing serious work on AI safety. Just to add, this is one of the things we're doing now at the Global Center on AI Governance. Later this month, we'll be launching what we call the African AI Safety Hub at UCT to kind of think about AI safety in very specific African context so that this conversation is not lost.
That's incredible. And please keep us posted on that work. We would love to engage with it when it comes out. Panelists, thank you so much. I took up an hour and a half of your time, and I hope I didn't waste too much of it. It was a pleasure to have you. For the audience, Thank you for engaging so thoughtfully, and these questions are great. If you guys wouldn't mind just putting in the chat how people can reach out to you or see your work or something, that would be great, just so people can follow up. But thank you all for joining us. Please go on our website to look up future programming. We have another virtual panel next week on sort of the way conflict in Africa is discussed in global media and sort of how that is complicated by these outdated and damaging tropes. It's on the 17th. You can register on our website. But once again, thank you all for joining. To our panelists, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for indulging me in my what I'm sure were kind of silly questions at times, but we'd love to keep engaging with you, and we'll see you guys at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Goodbye.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.